What's on your playlist right now?
As I move into my class,
Go to guilty pleasure food.
Ice cream.
Ice cream.
Hi, my name is Amanda Geyer, and I'm a professor in the Department of Human Ecology and a faculty researcher at the Center for Mind and Brain at the University of California at Davis. I'm also the Associate Dean for Human and Social Sciences for the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. Born and raised in New York City, I came to UC Davis in the summer of 2009 to start as an assistant professor, a big difference for a city kid. I'm a developmental psychologist who uses tools from cognitive neuroscience to study how children and adolescents navigate the social and emotional challenges of growing up. My research focuses on how brain development shapes how youth interpret their social world and how those experiences in turn remodel the brain to influence their risk for mental health issues, such as anxiety and depression.
Amanda, welcome to Face to Face.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. We're looking forward to the conversation. Really want to know more about your research and what you do and what's exciting to you. The first question I would ask, though, is how did you get to UC Davis?
So I after graduate school, I started a postdoc at the NIH, and it was a postdoc where I was able to bridge my training in applied developmental psychology with neuroscience, and I was there for about 6 years. And I will say that the economic downturn occurred when I was applying for faculty jobs, and but luckily for me, the Davis job was still open, and I came out and interviewed, and it was just the perfect fit for what I do, and so forth. So
Well, it's lucky for you and lucky for us as well.
thank you.
Now, rumor has it your career started with Hawaiian Punch.
That's true.
Can you explain that?
I will. So I grew up in New York City and public school, and we every year we had science fairs, and I loved doing these science projects. Often my dad would help me figure out recording electricity in fruit or what have you. But finally, in 8th grade, I had my own independent research idea, which was every day I had, in 8th grade, $2 for lunch money, which we were allowed to go out to eat at that age, and I would go and buy a slice of pizza, a can of Hawaiian Punch, and a bag of M&Ms. And it occurred to me after some time, like, maybe this Hawaiian Punch is not so great for my teeth. And over all these years, I had actually held on to my baby teeth. And so I devised my own experiment for our science fair where I created different concentrations of Hawaiian Punch, put my teeth in each one, and I monitored them every day and checked them for discoloration or disintegration and what have you, and so forth. So that was my very first independent research project.
What conclusions did you draw?
100% concentration of Hawaiian Punch, not good for your teeth.
I'll stop there. I don't want the Hawaiian Punch people to come after us.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, from there, what drew you to mental health and specifically to teen mental health?
Yeah. I started out in graduate school actually focused on early childhood, but I was very, very interested, and that's what brought me to the mentor that I worked with, interested in doing work that would help kids in some way, applied research. And over time in graduate school, through courses I took and talks I went to, I just became very, very interested in the mental health aspect, like how kids were behaving and feeling and so forth. And I had a very sort of pivotal experience listening to a talk, learning about the effects of child abuse on children's stress response systems. So the effects of the environment, experience on their bodies. And then that took me into my postdoc, where I was learning how to do neuroscience, so I could study the brain, because we know that there's a very tight relationship between how our brains are operating and our behavior.
So what kind of work are you doing in your teen lab currently?
So I have been really lucky to work in a number of longitudinal cohort types of studies. that were started, even before I got here to UC Davis. So colleagues of mine created samples of children when they were younger, and I had the great opportunity to collaborate with them and build in a protocol to these studies to look at brain development in the children in conjunction with mental health variables as well. And so for a long time I've been focused on that work. I've had a really exciting other angle in work that I've been doing, where I've been involved with colleagues who are in the Institute of Global Nutrition and the Department of Nutrition. So there's been a long-standing study of prenatal nutrient supplementation through a randomized control trial. And again, in a similar kind of model of bringing in neuroscience later in development, we've been able to assess children who've been studied as part of this RCT later in development to see what effects that supplementation had on their development.
Oh, very interesting stuff. Now, I've heard it said that there is right now a teen mental health crisis.
Yeah.
So first, do you agree? And if so, what do you think is driving that?
I do agree. I think that we've seen very high rates of anxiety, depression, even suicidality among children. Certainly the pandemic fueled some of that. I think for some children, experiences on social media has also contributed. It's never solely one thing. These things are very multifaceted, and it's important to recognize that and pull lots of pieces of information together. And I think children today are grappling with a lot of big issues.
I think it's certainly a lot more challenging than when I was a teenager, for example.
Right.
I also wonder what makes the adolescent brain different than other phases of life. I mean, I hear a lot about the prefrontal cortex in males, and mine's probably still not quite there yet, but how does that come into play? Yeah.
So for a long time, the thinking in the field was that brain development was kind of done by age 5 and so forth. So, but with the advent of tools like MRI, we were able to start imaging the brain, and probably about 25 years ago or so, the very first studies were done of using those tools with children. And that's just, it's important to also add that at the start, those tools were easier to use with older children because you have to lie very still in a magnet and so forth. Today, we have a lot more advancements in these technologies that allow us to go even younger, but that's been part of that. Yeah.
So from all that you've learned, what would you say is the biggest misconception about mental health in teens and preteens?
I think that one of the big misconceptions is that it's part of they're doing it on purpose, or it's just part of teenage years are just sort of tumultuous and that sort of thing. And I think we don't give quite enough kind of a positive frame on adolescents and all the things that they're capable of doing and can do. And I think it's we need to kind of reframe how we think about teenagers. And a lot of that has come from our understanding of the teenage brain. Some of the unique things that we know about in that period of adolescent development in the brain is that, yes, the brain is very sensitive to rewards and things that you really want to go after. And part of that's normative development, right? We want children to take good risks and go out and try new things and figure out who they are and what they like. But they're also very susceptible to influences around them, particularly peers. They also have sort of a lower tolerance for stress and things like that. And
so one of those influences is definitely social media, right? Mm-hmm. So, in fact, well, let me just say this. I got on social media initially many years ago to monitor what my teenage daughters were doing on social media.
Yeah. Yep.
And then they promptly got new identities that I didn't know about, and I, didn't have a clue. But anyway, what advice would you give parents with respect to social media?
Yeah, it's such a tricky space because it's pervasive in kids' lives now, and I think that for parents, one of the key pieces of advice is to talk to your kids about it and normalize parts of it so that there isn't a creation of sneakiness or hiding and that sort of thing, but being more open about it and the positive parts and the negative parts and what it can do for you and what it can't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And in a related topic, cell phones, my wife and I debated a lot about what was the right age to give them cell phones. What do you think about that, and whether cell phone use should be restricted, those type of ideas?
That's a very hot topic right now,
Yeah.
right? And certainly in the policy space, in trying to limit access to phones during the school hours and so forth. I think that it's a conundrum because for some kids they use it to stay in touch with their parents during the day, or if there's an emergency, and we've certainly seen lots of emergencies which phones have helped facilitate connection for parents in those ways. But it's also pulling on attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's pulling kids away from the tasks that they might have on hand and so forth.
Well, all the challenges that young people are facing, how can we help them be resilient in the face of all that?
Yeah. I think that it's important to recognize how the fact that their brains are changing, recognize that they are maybe more sensitive to emotional information, and because that prefrontal cortex is still developing into young adulthood, balancing sort of the heightened emotions with more of that control is a work in progress, right? And so I think just A, recognizing that, but B, figuring out ways to work with kids in these kinds of spaces and work with kids on other aspects of life and recognizing maybe we need to help them feel respected and heard and have a purpose. All those kinds of features of life that sort of make us human. I think supporting teenagers in those realms is really important.
And I think that could lead to them feeling supported and resilient later in life as well. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Now, at the Center for Mind and Brain, where you do your work, it's a very interdisciplinary environment. You've got psychologists and neuroscientists and maybe even a few engineers, I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you think that interdisciplinarity impacts the work that you do?
It is so pivotal and foundational to what we're doing. And I think part of that is that as any one scientist trained in a single discipline, it's hard to grasp all aspects, right? And so if we can pair up together with a bioengineer and somebody who studies stress response or brain function, we can kind of build off each other's strengths in order to create new solutions to problems, right? So I think that's really important.
There's some synergy there that
Exactly.
develops. Yeah. I also would think that the support of the federal government for this research is pretty important. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's been incredibly important to have federal funding. In part, conducting some of these studies is costly. There's a high cost to running an MRI, for example, and being able to use these kinds of technologies and have access to them. Recruiting large enough sample sizes, being able to support staff that help you test subjects, participants, work with families, collect the data, process the data. There's so many steps along the way that we really need that federal support. And in turn, I think that it's such a great investment because these are our youth, right? And they're the ones that are, going to go out and lead new things in society and so forth. So,
what do you think we'd be missing if we did not have the federal support for this work?
I think we'd be missing our opportunities of understanding subtleties and nuances in how youth develop and how mental health challenges emerge. And then in turn, this kind of research is really critical for finding new interventions and new kinds of therapies of all sorts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's key, and I don't think that there would be a good replacement source of funding either. So, I'm going to now change gears, Amanda.
Okay.
Something we like to do on Face to Face is it's called Hot Seat. You're on the proverbial hot seat.
Okay.
And all that means is I'm going to ask you some questions where I'm looking for a short answer, one word, one sentence sort of answer.
Sure.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to boost your mood immediately, what's your go-to song on your playlist?
Oh, my go-to song. I actually love Levitate by Dua Lipa.
Oh, okay. I wouldn't have guessed that.
That gets me dancing.
All right,
yeah.
I like that.
Uh-huh.
Okay. What is something about mental health we know today that not even scientists would not have even believed 50 years ago?
I think that one of the things that we've learned is that it's not one size fits all, right? So there are so many sort of permutations and combinations of symptoms, of behaviors, that any one thing won't work for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not one theory that solves all the problems.
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite food from New York that you can't find here in California?
Oh, probably a good bagel.
Okay. I thought you were going to say a deep dish pizza or something like that.
Yeah, I'd say a bagel.
A bagel. Okay. Okay. Besides the Arboretum, what's your favorite place to relax on campus?
On campus, we have a really cool space connected with my department over by Hunt Hall that our landscape architecture program has designed and built, and it's a very calming, beautiful space with lots of places to sit and relax.
There are hammocks over there, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And swings and
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Now it's your turn. You can ask me anything.
Okay. So a couple questions. One is, who would you say is your favorite daughter?
They're both my favorites. And they know who they are.
Yeah. This is a question I always get asked. So it's fun to ask that.
They each think the other one is my favorite, though.
Yeah, right,
So,
right. You have to navigate that. What would you say is the best parenting advice you ever received?
Wow. I would say let them fail, you know.
Yeah.
That's something I got from my dad, actually. He was very big on not my mother and he not giving me too much help.
Yeah.
And so I kind of took that with me. And when the girls were in school, I would say, okay, we're not doing the project for you, you know. And even if they made some mistakes, they got to make those mistakes and learn from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We call that scaffolding.
Yeah.
In our
Okay.
in our discipline.
No, I know the name
yeah.
of it. All right.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. It's very important, right? We learn from doing, and so even we learn from mistakes.
Right.
And yeah. So it's great.
Anything else?
I guess a last question I might have is what career might you have picked for yourself alternative to what you went into?
So I used to think I wanted to be an architect. I liked to draw when I was a kid. But then I also, my grandfather owned a tavern in St. Louis, and I could kind of see myself being a tavern owner.
Okay.
Not so much for the drinking part, but for the socialization and talking to the customers and being their, you know, fake psychologist part.
It's community.
You know? Yeah. That was very cool. So either one of those two, I think, would have worked for me.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Nice.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for being here with us today on Face to Face. We had a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. And thank you all for watching. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next month for Face to Face with Chancellor May.